In a Dallas courtroom packed with 246 spectators and 18 cameras, Melania Trump sued Jasmine Crockett, claiming just 31 words shattered her legacy. What began as a defamation case turned into a political firestorm when a surprise witness unraveled everything in just 9 seconds. When power meets defiance under oath, who walks away with the truth? In the next few seconds, you will witness the truth that they never wanted the public to know. The court docket time-stamped it at 7:42 a.m., but the explosion hit at 8:00 sharp. 24 newsrooms scrambled to verify what they couldn't believe. Melania Trump has filed a defamation lawsuit against Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. Those 15 words didn't just shake headlines, they detonated them. Morning anchors dropped their scripts mid-sentence. Legal analysts appeared half-dressed via satellite feeds. Within an hour, every major cable network had broken into programming, with red banners blaring one phrase, "First Lady declares war." This wasn't just a lawsuit, it was a seismic rupture in the rules of power. Melania Trump, the First Lady, who had built an empire out of being untouchable, inscrutable, and above the fray, had made her move not in a private statement, not in a carefully curated interview, but in open court, dragging a sitting member of Congress into the harshest light imaginable. The same woman who had once graced fashion magazines without uttering a full paragraph was now unleashing the full force of the legal system on one of the most vocal political firebrands in America. And the world had one burning question: why her Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a name on a congressional roll call. She was chaos in a tailored blazer, the type of voice that cracked decorum like glass. A former courtroom defender turned political cannonball. Her speeches didn't simmer, they scorched. She grilled cabinet members like she was back in trial, cross-examining power, with a voice sharpened by decades of defending the unheard. And now she was the target of a woman whose silence had once been louder than her husband's scandals. The contrast was cinematic. Melania silent, smooth polished to the point of being myth. Crockett raw, loud, unapologetic, a walking microphone for the ignored. Outside the courthouse in Dallas, under the thick Texas heat, the city buzzed like something biblical was about to unfold. Protesters clashed, supporters lined up. Journalists leaned over barricades just to catch a glimpse of the women at the center of America's newest obsession. Inside, reporters fought for front-row seats, as if it were the Oscars of reputation warfare. And in the back of every mind, one chilling thought echoed: this isn't about law, it's about control. Because if Melania Trump, the queen of calculated calm, had finally broken her silence, it meant something more dangerous than words had been spoken. It meant her image, her armor had been pierced. She hadn't responded to tabloid rumors. She hadn't blinked through her husband's impeachments. But she responded to Jasmine Crockett, and not with a tweet or a press conference, with a lawsuit. So the question hung in the air, heavy as the gavel that hadn't yet dropped. What did Jasmine Crockett say that Melania Trump couldn't afford to let live? This wasn't just a courtroom battle. It was the beginning of a reckoning. She didn't ask for the spotlight. She burned her way into it. Before the hashtags, before the hearing room cameras, before the courtroom headlines that etched her name beside Melania Trump's Jasmine Crockett, stood in dimly lit Dallas courthouses defending the forgotten, the accused, the voiceless. She was the lawyer you called when your son got pulled over at midnight and didn't come home. When no one else would show up, she did shoulders, squared voice, steady eyes locked on systems that had already written people off. Even back then, she didn't whisper. She projected. Judges rolled their eyes. Prosecutors clenched their jaws. Jasmine. She only got louder. Her words were blunt sometimes, brutal, but never empty. And if the truth made people squirm good, that meant they were listening. She built her reputation not on political polish, but on the power of standing up in rooms designed to make people small and refusing to sit down. And Washington noticed. When she won her congressional seat, critics said she'd mellow out. The hill will break her down, they muttered. She'll fall in line like the rest. But Jasmine Crockett didn't come to Washington to decorate the chambers. She came to dismantle their silence. And once she had a mic, once the red light turned on in those televised hearings, she became a weapon no one could control. She roasted billionaires in 3-minute sound bites. She carved through evasive answers with courtroom precision. She interrupted silence with receipts file folders and words that refused to be ignored. The public loved her fire. Lobbyists feared it. Veterans of the game whispered her name with a mixture of awe and exasperation. But the establishment had no idea how to handle someone who couldn't be bought, bossed, or buried in procedural noise. And then came the moment. One speech, one sentence too far depending on who you asked. Jasmine didn't name names, but she pointed fingers. She spoke of whispers in back rooms, of names attached to hidden deals, of the elegant women in the shadows who profited from chaos while pretending they weren't part of it. The subtext wasn't subtle. Melania Trump was never mentioned, but the implication landed like a hammer dropped on marble. And suddenly that silence Melania had worn like a silk veil for years. It wasn't enough. She had to respond. To her supporters, Melania's lawsuit was a stand for dignity. But to millions watching, it reeked of something far older, a system trying to crush the voice that refused to bow. Because Jasmine Crockett wasn't just inconvenient. She was unafraid. And in halls where power depends on people flinching, she didn't. The courtroom wasn't her punishment. It was her proving ground. And somewhere, deep inside the East Wing's gold leaf silence, someone had decided she talks too much. She sees too much. She has to be stopped. But stopping Jasmine Crockett never worked before. Why would now be any different? The clip was only 13 seconds long, but in the hands of the media it moved like a guided missile. One congressional hearing, a routine budget question. Then Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, looked dead into the camera, and said the line that broke the ceiling wide open: if names are being kept off paper and hands stay clean in public, then maybe it's time we asked what role certain first ladies play behind closed doors. No shout, no slur, no accusation, just implication. Sharp, surgical, lethal. Within hours, every network had it on loop. MSNBC called it bold. Fox News called it disgraceful. TikTok cut it into slow-mo edits layered with heartbeat sounds. Instagram swarmed with black and white stills of Crockett's face mid-sentence, her finger just barely tapping a folder labeled Advisory Influence Unnamed Parties. And when asked if she'd retract the comment, Crockett didn't blink. Truth doesn't need permission, she said into a sea of microphones. If they want me silent, they'll have to drag me through the fire, and I don't burn easy. The crowd behind her erupted. Flags waved, chants rose, but so did something darker. In upper floors of Capitol buildings, in private estates shielded by security gates, phones rang without stopping. The phrase she crossed a line was whispered like prayer. Not because of what she said, but because of what she nearly exposed. On-air personalities dissected her every word like they were reading a prophecy. Did she mean Melania directly? Was this a broader critique, or did she know something? But Crockett gave them nothing more. No clarifications, no walkbacks. Just that stare, that courtroom calm that unsettled even the most seasoned spin doctors. Inside conservative circles, the mood snapped. This isn't oversight, it's a witch hunt, barked one host. Donors threatened to pull funding from committee chairs unless they reined her in. Melania's legal team huddled behind closed doors pressure, mounting not just from pundits, but from very real names with very real money. Because somewhere in that 13-second clip, Crockett had stepped on a landmine. It wasn't just about Melania's name. It was about a wall of invisible influence operating under the guise of silence, elegance, and plausible deniability. And Crockett, without even naming names, had made the outline visible. That's what made it dangerous. That's why it had to be punished. The lawsuit wasn't crafted overnight. It was carved, word by word, framed not just as legal action, but as deterrent. You want to speak like that again? You want to lift the curtain? We'll see how loud your voice is when it echoes in a courtroom under oath. But Jasmine had been under fire long before she had a congressional pin on her lapel. She knew the difference between noise and a threat, and when she read the filing, she didn't flinch. She circled the plaintiff's name, Melania Trump, then quietly whispered, "So it's that deep." Because this wasn't about hurt feelings. It wasn't even about reputation. This was about what gets hidden and who pays the price for pulling back the veil. The lawsuit made one thing clear: Jasmine Crockett hadn't just said too much. She'd gotten too close. So the question wasn't whether her words crossed a line. The real question, the one they feared the most, was, what else was she about to say? And what are the powerful so afraid, you might say? That they'd rather drag you into court than let you speak it aloud. By sunrise, the Earl Cable federal courthouse in downtown Dallas looked more like a battlefield than a place of justice. 28 satellite trucks circled the block. Protesters, draped in flags and fury, pressed against barricades, chanting into megaphones until their voices cracked. On one side, supporters of Jasmine Crockett, fists raised, and signs reading, "Truth isn't defamation." On the other, defenders of Melania, Trump holding laminated posters that simply said, "Elegance under fire." The temperature climbed past 91 degrees by 8 a.m., but no one moved. They were waiting, watching. Because this wasn't just a trial, it was a confrontation between two archetypes of American womanhood. Inside, the air conditioning hummed, but it couldn't cut the heat. The courtroom was packed with journalists, congressional aides, and local citizens who had lined up before dawn just for a seat. Reporters clutched notepads like lifelines. Sketch artists leaned in pencils, ready not to capture legal arguments, but the unspoken war of presence playing out on either side of the room. Melania Trump entered first. Stone-still posture, cream-colored suit, jaw set like porcelain molded under pressure. She moved like every step had been rehearsed, her eyes hidden behind the kind of stillness that dared anyone to read her. Her legal team surrounded her like a wall of marble, sharp edges, perfect suits, no loose smiles. Then came Jasmine Crockett. No silk gloves, no curated silence. Her stride was swift, jaw tilted with purpose, and her hair pulled back just enough to reveal the steel in her eyes. She wore a bold blue dress, no apologies, and carried a single black folder under her arm as if it contained the weight of 1,000 unheard voices. When she reached the defense table, she paused just long enough to scan the gallery. A single nod, controlled, defiant, alive. The tension between them wasn't spoken, but it didn't need to be. They hadn't exchanged a word, hadn't met each other's gaze, but the silence between their tables vibrated like a live wire. This wasn't about one sentence or one lawsuit anymore. This was about what each woman stood for. Melania represented restraint, constructed elegance, an image shaped by power and preserved through distance. Crockett represented disruption, unfiltered force, voice-first politics that refused to be diluted. And the room felt it. Every lawyer, every clerk, every spectator. Even the judge adjusted his robe like he was preparing for a storm. When the bailiff called the court to order, the sound echoed like a thunderclap across glass. One woman didn't flinch. The other didn't blink. They weren't just women now. They were symbols. They were warnings. They were mirrors. And somewhere behind those walls, America leaned forward, breath held, heart split, waiting to see which version of truth would survive the trial. The gavel hadn't been down for 10 seconds before Philip Ransom rose from the plaintiff's table, precise, composed, deadly. His voice cut through the courtroom like a scalpel. This is not about politics. This is about damage. Real, irreversible, reputational harm. He stepped toward the jury box with a rhythm that had convicted CEOs and silenced senators. Behind him, Melania Trump sat motionless, hands folded, face unreadable, but her presence filled the room like smoke. Ransom continued pacing now, his tone sharp as steel. When a sitting congresswoman accuses the First Lady of covert influence in government deals without evidence in front of millions, that's not oversight. That's a surgical strike on dignity. He gestured toward Melania, who blinked once slowly, her only response to the fire building around her name. Then came the witnesses. A media analyst from New York took the stand, projecting graphs onto courtroom monitors. Red lines surged across the screen like heart attacks, tracking every TikTok edit, YouTube breakdown, and news cycle fueled by Crockett's quote. Her statement became a headline, then a movement, then a weapon. Next, a public relations expert with white gloves and a perfect accent testified, "Even if a statement is untrue or unproven, it leaves a scar. Perception is its own kind of truth." The jury scribbled furiously. Crockett didn't flinch. She stared straight ahead, lips tight, hand, gripping the edge of her chair like the courtroom itself might tilt. Then it was the defense's turn. Linda Garvey stood with calm fire in her voice and a binder thick as the Constitution. She didn't waste time on preamble. "My client is not on trial for slander. She's being punished for asking the kind of question this country was built on." She walked slowly toward the jury, each heel click louder than the last. What Congresswoman Crockett said wasn't reckless. It was responsive. It was rooted in pattern precedent and protected speech. You don't sue a woman for speaking on behalf of the public unless you're terrified of what she might say next. Crockett nodded slightly once. Not for show, for herself. The emotional battle lines were drawn. Melania's camp played the long game, calm tones, injured elegance, the optics of silent suffering. Crockett's team wielded sharpened truth like a blade, unafraid to get close, even if it cut deep. The jury sat suspended in the crossfire between marble stillness and lightning strikes. One side begged for order. The other dared the storm to come. The judge called for recess. No one moved. In that stillness, it became clear. This wasn't just a courtroom dispute. It was a war between two worldviews, one that demanded silence to preserve power, and one that believed truth was duty no matter the cost. As the courtroom emptied for recess, Jasmine Crockett stayed seated, eyes forward, spine straight, but her breathing slow and deliberate, like she was holding back a storm behind her ribs. Her attorney leaned in to speak, but Crockett lifted one finger just barely. Not yet. The noise had faded, but the war was still echoing inside her chest. She could feel it in her shoulders, the weight of it. Not just the lawsuit, but the silence they were trying to buy. Voiceover begins. Low. Controlled. Heavy. They think this is new, that I'll fold once it's federal. But they don't know what I've already survived. The image flickers Jasmine at 12 years old, standing in the corner of a living room, as her father argues with an officer over a broken taillight that turned into a citation he couldn't afford. Then again, 17, sitting on the floor of the school library, circling scholarships she had no business believing she could win. And then again, 24, fresh out of law school, taking calls at 2 a.m. from mothers who couldn't find their sons in county jail. They think I fear being sued, she exhales. But I've always feared something else, being silenced. Back in the courtroom, Garvey flips through notes beside her. Jasmine stares ahead. The American flag behind the judge's bench is still, but the thoughts inside her are anything but. This case wasn't about slander. It was about pressure. Apply enough and even the loudest voices will shake. But Jasmine had spent her life learning to stand still in rooms that wanted her small. This one was just better lit. She turned slightly toward her lawyer, leaned in, and whispered beneath the noise of the cameras resetting. They want me quiet. Pause. I'll speak louder. No smile. No drama. Just a promise. The bailiff called for order, and the shuffle of returning jurors filled the space like footsteps in a canyon. Crockett adjusted her blazer, but not her posture. She didn't need to, because this wasn't just about what she had said. It was about why she said it, and what it meant to millions watching who'd never had a mic, never sat behind the defense table, but knew exactly what it felt like to be told lower your voice or we'll take it away. In that moment, she wasn't a politician. She was a mirror. And across the country, people saw themselves in her, tired, cornered, but unbreakable. The judge re-entered. The jury returned. The next phase was about to begin. But one question now hung in the courtroom like a blade suspended above history's throat. Can truth survive in a world that values performance over principle? It didn't begin in a courtroom. It began under studio lights, white-hot, unforgiving, and live. The clip, now infamous, had started like any other segment. Jasmine Crockett sat across from a panel of Beltway regulars, framed in an unforgiving close-up lashes, still damp from pre-show eye drops, voice measured like a surgeon's breath before the first incision. The topic, transparency in federal contracts. The real tension, what no one wanted to name. And then Crockett did what Crockett always does. She didn't accuse. She observed. It's interesting, she said, fingers, steepled eyes locked forward. We keep acting like some of these high-dollar overseas infrastructure deals happened in a vacuum. But I've seen the visitor logs. I've seen who had seats at the table, even those who pretend they didn't. She didn't say Melania Trump. She didn't have to. The panel froze. One host coughed. Another tried to pivot. Are you suggesting the First Lady? But Jasmine interrupted with a smirk that didn't quite reach her eyes. I'm not suggesting anything. I'm just reminding folks that silence doesn't always mean absence. Sometimes it's a strategy. And just like that, the air shifted. Not in the studio, not just online, but across Washington. By nightfall, the moment had already been clipped, subtitled, looped, and memed. TikTok versions spliced her stare over thunderclaps. Twitter turned the quote into a rallying cry. And on cable news, political analysts sat at glossy desks whispering the one phrase every insider knows is code for danger. She touched the third rail, not because she lied, but because she pointed at the truth while it was still trying to hide behind velvet curtains. Within 24 hours, think pieces popped up titled, "Is the East Wing Really Apolitical? What Did Crockett Actually Know? The Myth of the Silent Spouse." And just beneath the surface, powerful donors began making phone calls that didn't show up on any log. Behind the marble walls of carefully choreographed influence, Jasmine had done something far more terrifying than accuse. She had named the pattern. She had drawn a dotted line from silence to strategy, from distance to deals. And that dotted line pointed somewhere dangerous. When Melania's legal team met the next morning, they weren't talking about damage control. They were talking about containment, about precedent, about making an example. Back in the studio, Jasmine had already moved on to her next interview. But across the country, across parties, across glass towers and Senate hallways, one truth was now undeniable. The fire hadn't started with a lie. It started with a mirror. And Jasmine Crockett had the nerve to hold it up steady while the world decided whether to look or to break the glass. The courtroom fell into a hush so complete it felt unnatural, like the air itself had been told to stay still. When Jasmine Crockett rose from her chair, she didn't look like a woman cornered. She looked like a woman walking into the fire she knew was waiting. One hand on the rail, one breath held in her chest, she stepped into the witness box as if it were her second skin. Not nervous, not angry, ready. She raised her right hand, swore the oath, sat, adjusted the mic like she'd done this 1,000 times because she had. But this time the stakes weren't a client's future. They were hers. Her attorney, Linda Garvey, began soft, steady. Congresswoman Crockett, "Why did you say what you said?" Jasmine didn't hesitate. "Because I represent people who don't get cameras and microphones. The single mothers. The kids with prepaid phones and no health insurance. The ones who get disappeared by the system and told they're too loud when they finally scream. If I flinch, so do they." Gasps rippled through the room, small, involuntary human. Garvey leaned in. "And did you mean to accuse the First Lady of criminal behavior?" "No," Jasmine said, calm as thunder before it strikes. "I meant to shine a light on a pattern. And I meant to remind this country that silence, strategic, deliberate silence, isn't the same thing as innocence." Then came Philip Ransom, stiff in his tailored wrath, approaching like a man preparing to skin a reputation alive. "Do you admit under oath that you had no hard evidence linking the First Lady to any misconduct?" The question hung like a blade. Jasmine didn't blink. "I had what any honest investigator begins with: a pattern. Access, timing, absence of transparency, influence with no fingerprints. That matters. Patterns matter. Or are we pretending corruption always comes with a confession?" The room shifted. Jurors leaned in. Even the judge stopped writing. Ransom's jaw tensed. "So you admit you made a damaging implication without proof?" "I made a connection," Jasmine replied, voice clipped like piano wire. "And if asking the right question becomes defamation, we might as well burn the First Amendment and bury every woman who ever challenged power." Someone in the gallery exhaled too loudly. The bailiff shot them a warning glance. Jasmine sat taller now, not to perform, to endure. And in that moment, something ancient cracked in the room, not legally but morally. The jury didn't just hear her, they began to believe her. Not because she was polished, but because she refused to be anything but real. And just like that, the woman on trial became something more dangerous than the plaintiff ever imagined. She became credible. And credibility in a courtroom like this is the one weapon no legal team can suppress. By the time Jasmine Crockett stepped off the witness stand, her face had already been seen by 8.3 million people. On TikTok, a clip of her saying, "Patterns Matter" was remixed with a gospel choir. On Twitter, the quote, "If I flinch, so do they," trended for 6 straight hours under Tardy Shatner's voice on trial. News outlets played the testimony like it was breaking news because it was. But outside the courtroom, something more dangerous was happening. People were feeling again. Supporters sent flowers to her district office in Dallas. Dozens of arrangements, many from people who had never voted before. Bouquets wrapped in brown paper arrived with handwritten notes, "You spoke for my daughter. Keep going. I've waited years for someone to say that out loud." But for every rose petal, there was a shard of glass. Her inbox flooded, some of it, love most of it, fire. Threats masked as criticism. Emails that began with, "Who do you think you are?" and ended with things no camera could ever air. Her staff filtered the worst, but Jasmine saw enough. Still, she said nothing. Not even when her phone buzzed 3 times during lunch with calls from blocked numbers. She chewed slowly, calmly, letting the chaos spin around her like smoke in a locked room. Then came the note, folded once, no envelope. Slipped to her quietly by a junior aide who didn't speak, only nodded. Jasmine unfolded it under the table, one slow crease at a time. "He's willing to testify. He says he was in the room. You were right." For a moment, Jasmine froze, not with fear, but with the sudden stillness of someone realizing the ground beneath them had just shifted. Again. She looked up slowly, eyes scanning the courtroom, though she didn't know who she was looking for. Melania sat rigid across the aisle, whispering into her lawyer's ear, unaware that a new shadow had just entered the stage, uninvited, unbought, and full of memory. Jasmine refolded the note, slid it into her pocket like a loaded weapon. She didn't speak. She didn't smile. But the lines in her forehead smoothed slightly as if the burden had just shifted a few inches off her shoulders. Outside, the chants were growing louder. Inside, the temperature dropped. Because now it wasn't just her voice echoing. Now someone else had decided to speak. And not from a podium, from inside the room. A room Jasmine had only seen in redacted reports and closed-door briefings. A room the public was never meant to know she had even mentioned. And so the question bled through the courtroom walls, into living rooms, onto feeds, into ears that had once been indifferent. What happens when the truth knocks and someone finally opens the door? The courtroom was still when his name was called. The defense calls, Robert Klein. No one moved. A beat passed. Then a man in a charcoal gray suit and wire-rimmed glasses rose quietly from the second row. No entourage, no folder, no fanfare. He walked like a man who had already lost everything he was afraid to lose. Reporters scanned their notes in confusion, whispering, flipping pages. No one remembered his name until he spoke. He took the oath with the calm of someone who didn't need to impress anyone. His eyes didn't search for cameras. His fingers didn't fidget. Even Jasmine Crockett furrowed her brow. Who was this man who had appeared like smoke in a locked room? Linda Garvey approached the bench, her tone steady, her words precise. "Mr. Klein, can you tell the court what your role was during the administration I served as a senior advisor to the Infrastructure and Foreign Investment Task Group?" he replied. No hesitation, no theatrics. Garvey stepped forward. "Were you ever in meetings involving members of the First Family?" "Yes." "Specifically, the First Lady?" Klein took a shallow breath. "Yes." The room seemed to stop breathing. Was she present during negotiations? She was in the room. Did she speak? She did. Did she influence any terms? A pause. Measured. Deliberate. Then yes. The word hit the courtroom like a detonation. A reporter's pen dropped. Someone in the gallery gasped audibly. Garvey froze, not out of fear, but strategy. She didn't follow up. She let the silence speak louder. But the press didn't wait. 2 reporters bolted from the back bench, stumbling over each other as they scrambled for the exit phones already ringing in their palms. One of them shouted into the hallway, "He just said she was in the room." Melania was in the room. On the plaintiff's side, Melania's attorney flinched. Melania remained still. Lips parted just slightly, eyes narrowing. Her public mask cracked, not shattered, but showing the first fracture. Jasmine Crockett watched without blinking. She didn't smile. She didn't nod. She simply locked eyes with Klein, and in that instant she knew he had carried this truth for years. Not for her, for himself, and now he had finally laid it down. The courtroom didn't buzz. It pulsed. The judge leaned forward. Jurors exchanged looks like they'd just witnessed a myth collapse into history, because in less than 10 seconds a man no one recognized had rewritten the narrative and cracked open the walls that silence had spent years trying to hold shut. And he wasn't done speaking. Not yet. Not by a long shot. The moment the word influence left Robert Klein's mouth, Melania's lead attorney exploded to his feet like a man jolted by live current. Objection, hearsay, speculative. This is an ambush. He has an agenda. His voice ricocheted off the walls. Sharp panic too loud for a courtroom that had spent days speaking in carefully rehearsed tones. But it wasn't just noise. It was desperation, a mass cracking in real time. The judge leaned forward, hands clasped, eyes narrowed, not ruling yet. Garvey didn't flinch. She let the tension stretch for half a second longer, then spoke with lethal calm. Your Honor, Mr. Klein is not speculating. He has documentation, emails, internal memos, and advisory meeting logs, all previously submitted under sealed discovery. That word documentation silenced the plaintiff's table like a thunderclap. Melania's attorney stammered, trying to regroup, but the damage was done. The jury turned. The gallery leaned forward. The cameras outside the courthouse, though banned from within, might as well have been flashing in rhythm to every breath being held inside. And for the first time since the trial began, Melania moved. Not dramatically, but visibly. She reached for her pen, then stopped. Her fingers curled slightly, then withdrew. Her chin dipped not down in shame, but just enough to register impact. The elegant porcelain had not shattered, but it had been chipped, and now everyone could see the fault line. Robert Klein remained calm. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't blink rapidly like a man under pressure. He simply opened a folder and slid a printed email forward. Subject line: Infrastructure Framework. Brief, with FLOTUS notes. Initials signed at the bottom: MT. The courtroom was silent enough to hear the click of a juror's pen. One woman in the back reached for her notebook, but missed her eyes too locked on what was unfolding. At the defense table, Jasmine Crockett didn't smile. She didn't smirk. She just watched, steady, measured, almost reverent. Because this wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about winning. This was about confirmation. The thing she'd been mocked for suggesting had now arrived with receipts. No monologue, no theatrics. Just a single witness who had no power left to lose and finally chose to use it. Garvey spoke again, quiet as a gavel before the strike. Let the record reflect the witness has supplied corroborating documents. The judge nodded slowly. The gallery didn't move. And somewhere beneath layers of spin and silence, an empire of image began to tremble. Not because of an attack, but because someone finally whispered, she was never just watching. She was in it. And now the world knew. There were no cameras in the courtroom, no microphones, no footage. But there didn't need to be. Because one sketch artist's pencil in the right hands became more powerful than a dozen news crews. The image was raw, unfinished lines, blurred faces, but one moment frozen with surgical clarity. Robert Klein, hand-raised lips, mid-sentence, Jasmine Crockett, watching in stillness, and Melania Trump turned slightly away, face tight, knuckles white. It was uploaded at 3:47 p.m. By 4:12, it was trending globally. The quote beneath it needed no embellishment. She was in the room. She spoke. She influenced terms. 9 seconds. That's all it took. 9 seconds of calm devastation, no shouting, no spectacle, just the quiet, clinical unveiling of something long, protected by velvet gloves and press silence. The internet dissected it like scripture. People rewound the transcript loop, word by word, breath by breath. Podcasts paused their midweek episodes to cover it. TikTok creators used the moment as a soundbite for slow zoom reaction videos, layered with trembling violins. Somewhere in the White House archives, the title First Lady still shimmered with ceremonial polish. But online, in living rooms and barbershops and break rooms, that image was cracking. Because the mystique only works when no one dares to speak. And someone had just spoken. Back in the courtroom, Melania's composure, so rehearsed, so relentlessly managed, finally slipped. She reached for her pen with a hand too tight. The plastic shaft snapped with a hollow pop, a sound small enough to ignore, but loud enough to break the room's spell. Her attorney reached for another, but she waved him off. Not angrily, not loudly, just fractured. For the first time, she looked like someone struggling to stay still. Across from her, Jasmine Crockett remained silent. She didn't lean forward. She didn't celebrate. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded, her expression unreadable. Because this was the moment her critics always feared, not her voice, but her restraint. Because sometimes not answering is the loudest move you can make. She had known that truth would surface. She hadn't expected it to arrive with documentation and deadpan calm, but she recognized its weight when it dropped. She didn't need to speak it herself. She had already cleared space for it to land. The jury saw it, the press felt it, and the public. They began to wonder if silence, when earned, could shatter 1,000 scripted words. Because now the question wasn't whether Melania had been defamed. The question was, can one sentence undo a lifetime of silence? By nightfall, the wildfire had jumped the courtroom walls. CNN aired a primetime segment titled "The 9 Seconds That Changed Everything." MSNBC played Robert Klein's quote on loop every hour on the hour, and TikTok, it erupted. Thousands of creators stitched the sketch image with whispered captions. She was in the room. She spoke. She influenced terms. The sound was turned into a trend, a slow burn zoom effect over the First Lady's face layered with piano keys and static. Across the airwaves, the question wasn't about defamation anymore. It was about legitimacy, about narrative, about trust. Did Melania lie? The headline ran like a fever across networks, magazines, newsletters. Podcasts dropped emergency episodes. YouTubers who once covered royal drama were now parsing through East Wing visitor logs. And behind every analysis, every clip, every reposted quote was the chilling realization that someone America thought they understood had just gone silent when it mattered most. The First Lady didn't issue a statement. She didn't hold a press conference. She vanished. Her social media accounts went dark. Her comms team offered no comment. For 48 hours, Melania Trump became a blank page. No photo ops, no leaks, no denials. Only the echo of her silence, once pristine, now suspicious, bouncing through every screen in the country. And in her absence, the world filled in the blanks. Some called Klein a hero, a patriot, a truth teller, a man who broke the machine. Others labeled him a traitor, bitter disloyal, a desperate ex-staffer. One late-night host cracked, "He's either the bravest man in Washington or the most suicidal." The audience roared. But even behind the laughter, something darker pulsed. The kind of unease that lingers when the mask comes off and the face behind it isn't what you expected. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett walked through the firestorm not untouched but unshaken. Her steps were steady, her posture was high. But behind her sunglasses, the toll was etched deep. She didn't flinch at flashing bulbs. She didn't pause when reporters shouted her name. But inside her, the adrenaline had begun to wear off, replaced by something heavier. Not fear, not even anger. Responsibility. Because this wasn't just her story anymore. It belonged to every woman who'd ever been told don't push it. To every whistleblower who'd been buried under silence. To every truth that had been wrapped in PR and hidden behind a polite smile. Her staff tried to shield her from the worst, but she heard it anyway. She heard the voicemail that hissed, "You're going to regret this." She read the email that warned, "You're about to find out why no one ever names her." And still she showed up, not for the cameras, not for revenge, but because walking away now would mean they win without even trying. So she walked tall, but she walked tired, because she knew the truth better than most. Winning isn't clean. It's not cinematic. It's quiet survival, one step at a time, through a world that only loves the truth when it's convenient. And right now, the truth was very, very inconvenient. The tremors didn't stop at the courthouse. They reached Capitol Hill like aftershocks, quiet at first, then relentless. In hushed committee rooms and private Senate lounges, lawmakers began murmuring what no one dared to say aloud last week. "Is this really about defamation?" one staffer asked, leaning over his notepad. "Or is it about silencing someone who got too close?" That question leaked into closed-door briefings, hallway conversations, even the White House press room, where a reporter finally asked, "Is the East Wing using litigation as intimidation?" On C-SPAN, Reporter Delgado paused mid-session and muttered on mic, "This doesn't feel like a lawsuit, it feels like a warning shot." And suddenly more voices joined. Democrats questioned the ethics. Independents raised eyebrows. Even two moderate Republicans broke party ranks and said they were deeply uncomfortable with the optics. But inside conservative circles, the knives came out. Right-wing media launched a full-scale counteroffensive. Headlines screamed, "Crockett's circus lies and leverage." This is not courage. It's chaos. Old video clips were dug up, edited, weaponized. One host declared, "If we let Congress members start accusing first ladies without evidence, we've surrendered civility for mob rule." And just like that, the talking point was born. She's reckless. She's theatrical. She's dangerous. But outside the Beltway, another movement ignited. Young organizers flooded TikTok, Instagram, and campus forums with videos of Jasmine's testimony and Klein's 9-second revelation. Activist groups held vigils not just in her district, but in swing states where silence had often been mistaken for diplomacy. Hashtags like "Watch House Truth Over Titles" and "She Spoke Anyway" began trending alongside grainy photos of Crockett walking alone through the courthouse halls, folder in hand, head high. At Howard University, students chalked her, quote, "If I flinch, so do they," across campus steps in bold white letters. In Phoenix, a high school debate team reenacted her cross-examination as part of their civics unit. One girl said after, "I didn't know we could be that brave," and in a modest manila envelope slid beneath her office door, without a return address, Jasmine found a letter handwritten in purple ink. It read, "I'm 14. My stepfather said girls shouldn't speak unless they're asked. But then I saw you. You didn't scream. You didn't cry. You just stood there and didn't flinch. And you made me believe silence isn't safety." Jasmine read it twice, then a third time. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. But her hand gripped the edges until the paper trembled. Because in a war built on narratives, some truths don't need to be shouted. They just need to be written by girls who were never supposed to have a voice. And in that moment, with that letter in her lap, Jasmine Crockett understood something deeper than polls, pundits, or procedural wins. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It never had been. She had simply been the one who said what so many were too scared to say out loud. The jury room was sealed like a vault, 12 people, one question, and 97 hours of pressure behind every breath. No voices leaked out, no cell phones. Just the occasional creak of a chair, the scrape of a legal pad, and the slow, suffocating churn of uncertainty. Inside that room, the fate of two women and the meaning of truth itself hung by threads woven tighter than anyone wanted to admit. In the courtroom, the clock ticked louder than usual. Every second felt like a closing door. Jasmine Crockett sat still, the same black folder in her lap, the same calm mask stretched across her face. But beneath it, her heart beat like a war drum. She had prepared for every outcome, victory, loss, mistrial. But no amount of preparation could numb the ache that came from knowing the verdict wouldn't undo what had already been done. You can't put the smoke back in the fire. You can't unspeak a truth once it lands. You can only brace for the echo. She stared at the floor, not out of fear, but focus. A whisper from Garvey at her side. A nod. A breath. The lights above buzzed faintly, as if they too were holding back. Across the room, Melania Trump sat behind her table like a monument to restraint, but even stone erodes. Her posture remained perfect. Her hands were folded, but in front of her sat a yellow legal pad untouched. A single line had been written earlier that morning in soft black ink. And now it sat there unfinished, glaring back at her like a ghost she could no longer control. She had built an empire on distance, on staying above the noise. But in this room with 12 strangers, weighing her silence against someone else's fire, the image no longer held. Not fully, not anymore. Outside, night fell like a curtain, velvet black, heavy with tension. Reporters paced the sidewalk in tight loops. Satellite trucks blinked against the dark. Protesters and supporters alike lit candles, held signs, and whispered prayers to cameras that kept rolling just in case. Inside, time slowed. Crockett adjusted her posture. Melania didn't move. Two women worlds apart, waiting in the same silence, but not the same stakes. One was fighting to be heard. The other was fighting to stay untouched. The bailiff appeared at the door for a split second, then vanished. A signal. A tremor. It was coming. Crockett closed her eyes just once. Not to rest. To center. To remind herself of everything she carried, names, letters. Silence turned into courage. None of that would be erased by what came next. But all of it would be marked. Verdict pending, nation watching, time slowing to a knife's edge. Because sometimes the loudest moment of a story is the second before it ends. And as the door clicked open once more, and the jury stepped forward, the final question hung in the air, silent as a blade. Is vindication ever enough when the damage was never just legal? The courtroom was no longer a place of law, it had become a pressure chamber. Even the air seemed to pulse with tension. Journalists froze mid-sentence. Legal clerks clutched pens like weapons. And on every TV across America, on every phone screen at every bus stop, millions watched with their breath half held, as if exhaling too early might tilt the scales. This is not about defamation, the final statement rang through the courtroom. This is not about decorum. This is about whether power can punish truth just because it makes them uncomfortable. The words echoed long after they were said. Jasmine Crockett sat forward, not slouched nor stiff, just still, like the eye of a storm refusing to flinch. Her team barely blinked. The folder on her lap, worn at the corners, had not moved since the first day of trial. It had held documents, quotes, patterns, but more than that, it had become a symbol of defiance, of preparation, of truth that didn't need to shout to be heard. Melania Trump didn't turn to look at the jury. Her gaze remained straight ahead, locked in place, as if she could will the moment to bend toward her narrative. Her fingers curled slightly beneath the table, not trembling, but tight. Then came the sound that cracked the room open. A single sheet of paper slipped from the jury foreperson's hand. It hit the wooden rail like a hammer. People gasped. The sound echoed like thunder. And then came silence again, so sharp it could slice glass. "All rise," the bailiff announced. 12 jurors filed in like ghosts carrying history, their faces unreadable, not tense, not relaxed, just carved in the stone of responsibility. The judge nodded. The foreperson cleared their throat. No theatrics, no dramatics, just the plain edge of justice being unsheathed. "We, the jury, in the matter of Trump versus Crockett." A pause. Somewhere in the back, a reporter's pen stopped moving. "Find in favor of the defendant, Representative Jasmine Crockett." The room erupted not in noise, but in energy. A wave of stunned stillness, then a swell. Gasps, sighs, hands flying to mouths. Someone sobbed. Someone whispered, "She did it." Reporters dashed for exits, phones raised like swords. Jasmine didn't cheer. She didn't flinch. She simply closed the folder on her lap and exhaled through her nose like someone who had waited years to finally breathe. Across the aisle, Melania blinked once. Her mouth parted, but no words came. She turned to her team, but they looked down. The judge banged the gavel once. Order. But no one would remember that. What they'd remember was the verdict, the silence before it, the image that cracked, the voice that didn't waver. And as Crockett turned toward the crowd, toward the sea of cameras, allies, critics, survivors, and strangers, she didn't smile. She nodded. Because sometimes justice doesn't roar. Sometimes it just holds its ground and wins. For a moment there was no sound, just the dull hum of realization filling every corner of the courtroom. The verdict still lingered in the air, suspended like smoke from a slow-burning fire. Jasmine Crockett didn't move immediately. Then with a quiet inhale, she lifted her right hand and pressed it gently to her chest. Not in celebration, in stillness, in acknowledgement of every voice that hadn't been believed, of every moment where silence had felt like survival. Across the aisle, Melania Trump blinked, just once. It wasn't dramatic, but it was revealing. A flicker of disbelief, or maybe of recognition of something slipping that could never be retrieved. Her shoulders, once poised like porcelain, sloped ever so slightly. The perfect composure she'd maintained for weeks now hung like an expensive gown, 2 sizes too heavy. Then the gavel dropped. The sharp crack echoed like lightning striking marble, official, final, and irreversible. No amount of PR spin, no velvet-lined statement from her team, no crafted Instagram post could unring that sound. The courtroom erupted into motion. Clerks stood, reporters surged toward the exits. Lawyers reached for their briefcases like soldiers retrieving weapons after war. But in the middle of it all, Jasmine remained seated, hands still on her hard eyes, scanning no one, yet seeing everything. Outside, the courthouse plaza shattered into a mosaic of emotions. Tears streamed down the faces of women holding homemade signs. Young activists screamed, "We see you," into microphones. Elderly veterans stood still, eyes glassy, with a kind of quiet vindication. Some wept, some cheered. Some simply stood hands on hips, as if trying to understand the history that had just unfolded in front of them. The sky, heavy and overcast all day, seemed to break open in sympathy, letting in shards of pale light that danced across the courthouse steps. But not everyone was relieved. Across the street, conservative protesters jeered. Witch hunt set up. Their flags waved like angry brushstrokes against the courthouse backdrop. Cable news vans buzzed with conflicting headlines. Crockett walks free. First Lady humiliated, a trial or a trap. Voices clashed, narratives tangled, the truth tugged in every direction, but none of it could undo what had already been spoken, what had already been heard, what had already landed. Inside, Melania rose slowly, her movement graceful but hollow. She didn't wait for aides, didn't glance back at the bench. She walked out like a statue, refusing to crumble in public, her legacy clinging to her like silk soaked in rain. Crockett finally stood. She didn't lift her arms. She didn't wave. She simply nodded once toward the judge, then toward the jury, then toward the gallery. Her eyes met those of a woman in the third row who had sat through every hour of testimony, silent, steadfast, forgotten by most. That woman mouthed one word, "Thank you," and Jasmine nodded again. Because sometimes justice doesn't roar. Sometimes it doesn't shout or gloat or demand. Sometimes it just places one hand over the heart and listens to the silence it finally earned. Outside the courthouse, microphones crowded like vultures hunting for a soundbite. But Jasmine Crockett didn't offer a roar. She stepped up to the podium, flanked by no entourage, no cheering squad, just stillness and wind. She looked out at the sea of cameras, not as prey, but as mirror. Then she spoke, calm, steady, unflinching. "This was never about me," she said, her voice crisp against the noise. "It was about all of us, about what happens when power decides who gets to speak and who gets erased." The air seemed to still. Journalists who had scribbled with frenzy now froze, pens hovering midair. In that moment, it wasn't a press conference. It was a reckoning. Her words didn't shout, they landed. And then she walked away. No fist pump, no smug smile, no turning to pose for the cameras. Just Crockett disappearing into the crowd, swallowed by the people who had carried her name like a banner through weeks of fire. A woman handed her a white rose. A teenager shouted, "Thank you," through tears. A man in a wheelchair raised his phone and whispered, "She did it." But this wasn't triumph. It was clarity. Across America, the story played on loop, not for drama, but for dignity. The moment Robert Klein pointed across the courtroom and said she was in the room. The second Melania's pen snapped in her hand. The shot of Crockett placing her palm over her chest like a quiet national anthem. Viewers didn't share it for gossip. They shared it to remember what it looked like when silence became strategy and truth broke through polished lies. Meanwhile, Melania vanished. Her last public appearance had been the day before the verdict. A cold walk through marbled corridors, head held high, lips tight like a zipper hiding too much. After that, nothing. No statement, no tweet, no defense. Her silence, once mistaken for grace, now trembled under the weight of public curiosity. It wasn't armor anymore. It was absence. Tabloids speculated. Friends grew scarce. Her defenders on cable news switched topics within a week, pivoting to safer scandals, younger targets. In the vacuum, questions bloomed. What did she know? Why did she stay silent? Was distance complicity or design? Crockett never answered those questions. She didn't have to. She returned to Congress, quietly greeted by staff with cautious pride. Young interns whispered her name like legend. Security guards nodded with reverence. She stepped into her office, placed the rose in a jar of water, and sat at her desk, not as a victor, but as a vessel. The lawsuit was over. The war was not. Letters poured in from shelters, schools, prisons. Survivors, mothers, daughters. Some had no words, just drawings. One envelope held a crumpled napkin with 4 words scribbled in shaky ink. "You made me speak." Outside, the world didn't stop. New headlines came. New controversies flared. But in the quiet corners, in libraries and classrooms and living rooms, something had shifted. And in that final beat, the question changed. It wasn't, will they silence her again? It was, when the powerful fail to silence you, What will you do with the voice they couldn't break? It started in a middle school civics class in Shreveport. A teacher dimmed the lights, clicked the remote, and the screen filled with the image of Jasmine Crockett standing calm, one hand over her chest, her voice ringing like steel wrapped in velvet. This, the teacher said softly, is what dignity under fire looks like. No one whispered. No one laughed. For 3 minutes, a room full of teenagers watched a moment that didn't need explosions to feel like an earthquake. By the next week, it had spread. A high school government class in Detroit paused their curriculum to study the courtroom exchange line by line, breaking down Robert Klein's 9-second confession, the symbolism of Melania's silence, and the national ripple effect from one woman refusing to fold. In college campuses from New York to Oakland, students recreated scenes from the trial in mock debates, but never as performance, always as study. Not for drama, for courage. Journalists picked it up like kindling. The New York Times ran a Sunday column titled, "The Courtroom That Echoed Through Us All." The Atlantic called it, "The Silence That Spoke Louder Than Law." Op-ed writers dissected not just Crockett's words, but her posture, her restraint, the refusal to gloat, her understanding that justice isn't the volume of one's voice, it's the weight of one's presence. In living rooms, mothers turned down the volume on reality shows to rewatch clips on their phones. They whispered to daughters, sometimes even to sons. She didn't flinch. Not when they smeared her name. Not when the courtroom turned into a circus. Not when power dressed itself in pearls and tried to pass itself off as innocence. Crockett didn't raise her voice. She held it, and that holding shook the floor. In barbershops, Crockett's name was spoken alongside Allie Parks Ginsburg, not as an equal but as a continuation, a thread in the fabric. She stood up, one barber said in Atlanta, but what really hit, she didn't move. On TikTok, a viral loop synced her stillness to a rising orchestra, her face like marble unmoving as flashes from the courtroom exploded behind her. The caption simply read, "When silence becomes strategy." Even churches picked up the momentum. In Baltimore, a preacher paused mid-sermon and gestured to the projector, showing Crockett's final statement. "This wasn't about me. It was about all of us." The congregation murmured. Some wept. Others just nodded. Because in an age of spectacle, of shouting matches on every screen, someone choosing stillness had felt radical. And yet Crockett never claimed sainthood. She didn't tour networks, didn't sign a book deal. When asked for interviews, she replied with a single sentence, "Let the record speak." And it did. Over and over. In classrooms, on dinner tables, in group chats, in protests, in whispered prayers. The legacy didn't come with confetti or fireworks. It came in the quiet, in the teacher who stood a little taller, the journalist who hit publish on a truth their editor warned against, the mother who told her daughter, "You don't have to yell to be heard," the student who wrote her name in a college application essay under the words, "Who inspires you?" Voices rose, not as echoes of Crockett, but as answers to the questions she never asked out loud. What if we all refused to flinch? The hallway lights had long shut off, leaving only a golden desk lamp casting quiet shadows on the worn carpet of her Capitol office. Outside, Washington slept. But inside those four walls, Jasmine Crockett sat still, back straight, eyes soft. In her hand, creased from hours of rereading, was the letter, the one from the teenage girl with the trembling handwriting that read, "You made me believe silence isn't safety." She read it again aloud this time. Her voice cracked, not from exhaustion, but from something heavier. Purpose. A single tear slipped down her cheek, cutting through the strength she wore like armor. It wasn't weakness. It was the weight of every woman who had ever swallowed the words they weren't allowed to speak, of every girl who thought survival meant staying quiet. Crockett let the moment sit. No cameras, no applause, no performance, just truth alone in a room. Across from her, stacked haphazardly, were boxes of court documents, media transcripts, old protest flyers still smelling faintly of rain. She leaned back, eyes drifting to the ceiling, and the memories came rushing like film reels, chaotic, raw, undeniable. The courthouse in Dallas where she first faced down a billionaire's legal army. The protest in Baton Rouge where she marched without makeup, her feet blistered, but her voice unwavering. The night she stayed until 4 a.m., revising a single sentence in a policy draft because she knew precision was the only protection for the truth. Her eyes closed and another image returned Robert Klein taking the stand. 9 seconds that shattered a myth. Melania's porcelain mask cracking. The gavel drop. The silence afterward when the courthouse trembled and the country held its breath. And then came the memory she couldn't shake the moment she chose not to smile in victory. Just placed her hand over her heart. She looked around her office. It was small by Washington standards. No gold trim, no marble busts. Just shelves of case files, faded photos of mentors now gone a red ribbon from her first legal win pinned to a corkboard. It wasn't much, but it was hers. Every inch earned, every scar behind it real. She whispered into the quiet still standing. Her voice didn't echo, but it didn't need to. The girl's letter remained on the desk right above a stack of unopened mail. Crockett didn't move to file it away. Instead, she placed it in the top drawer, with reverence next to the folded program from her grandmother's funeral, and the worn photo of her as a first-year law student, unsure but burning with promise. That drawer wasn't for trophies. It was for reasons. Outside, a distant rumble of thunder rolled through the Capitol sky, like a reminder that storms will always return. But Crockett didn't flinch. She never had. She rose slowly, gathering her coat, and turned off the desk lamp. Darkness settled over the office, but it wasn't empty. It was full of echoes. Not applause, not headlines. Just a woman who didn't bend, and never would. Somewhere in a middle school hallway in Des Moines, a framed courtroom sketch hangs above a row of blue lockers. Beneath it, a single brass plate reads, "She didn't flinch." Children pause between classes, backpacks slipping, gazes lingering just long enough to wonder why a woman's stillness is memorialized in charcoal. In a quiet home in Birmingham, a mother rewinds a 9-second clip of testimony, not for the facts but for the feeling. Her daughter curled beside her on the couch, mouths along with the words. On Capitol Hill, a janitor replacing a hallway light catches sight of an aide tacking up a new flyer. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, open forum on civil courage. He nods once, then keeps working. Across the country, signs still rise in windows. Silence isn't safety power, doesn't equal truth, and the most common of all, still standing. But Crockett herself isn't in those places. She's walking down a cracked sidewalk in Dallas Hood up unnoticed. No security, no cameras, just her and the echo of her own steps. She passes a bookstore window with a quote scribbled on the glass, "Truth doesn't shout." It stands still while the world screams around it. She stops for a breath. Not because she's tired, but because she feels the weight of what's next. Her phone buzzes. Not a call. Just a photo someone hung the girl's letter next to the U.S. Constitution in a civics classroom. A quiet exhale escapes her lips. The voiceover begins steady and low. We live in a world where noise is power, but sometimes the loudest act is to not move, to not yield, to not break. You won't always have a courtroom or a microphone, but you will always have a choice. In your own life, will you speak even when it's safer to be quiet, or will you let someone else write your story? Fade to black. 3 words linger on screen. Still, she rose. This story reminds us that silence is not weakness, it is a choice. In a world that often rewards noise, outrage, and performance, true strength lies in stillness, clarity, and conviction. Jasmine Crockett didn't shout to be heard. She stood steady and let the truth speak for itself. For those of us over 50, this is a powerful reminder. Our lived experience, our wisdom, and our quiet courage still matter. We don't need to match the volume of the world, we need to model its conscience. In moments when others expect you to retreat, what legacy will your response leave behind? Think of a time you stayed silent when you had something meaningful to say. What would change if you spoke now, not to win, but to honor the truth? This week, share one truth boldly, quietly, but unmistakably. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.